we've been joined now by Sheila Duffy from the Glasgow and West of Scotland Family History Society. So she's going to tell us a little bit about their society and what they do. So can you tell us, I don't know, how long has the society been going? What areas do you cover?
Well, the interesting thing is, it did start quite a long time ago in 1977. There was a small group of interested people. And of course, that was long before most people had computers. I think even in universities, it was only those and such as those that had computers. And in 1977, it was mostly people who had a background in research or academia or librarianship, something like that, who got together. Joe Fisher, for example, who was head librarian in the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. Helen Cargill Thompson, who worked in the Strathclyde Library, University Library, and people like that. Not all people who'd had, an in-depth education. There was Tom Walsh. Tom Walsh was a very down-to-earth, ordinary person, and I mean that as a compliment, of course, ordinary, from Shettleston. And he was just very interested. He was a church elder, and he was just very interested in, his church records and what had been kept and what had been thrown away. So it was just a handful of interested people who got together. Then, of course, as the years went on, it grew and grew. They had to get office premises because people wanted to, well, in those days, they were looking at microfiche and microfilm. I can't remember when we got our first computer, but it was a bit like the launching of the Queen Elizabeth. You thought, goodness, what are we going to do now? Now, of course, most people who come into, we've got premises in Partick where normally members would come in to do some of their research, particularly if they need help. Closed at the moment because of COVID, of course. But when people came in, they were looking, as I say, at microfiche, microfilm, books, looking at old parish records on these sort of devices. But now it's nearly all computers that people want, as you can understand. Very occasionally, we've got all our films still, and we've got all our microfiche, and very occasionally people will go and say, oh, I'm going to get the 1841 out and see if I can find these people somewhere in Glasgow. So that it is useful to have them, but there's no doubt the world has changed completely. Yeah. And also the kind of people that have joined as well. Obviously, in the beginning in the 70s, it was mostly people who were living in the Greater Glasgow area. But very soon we found out there were people, particularly Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the English-speaking world, who found that we existed. And this was in the days before the internet and the and websites, of course. So we had to often take adverts in family history magazines in all of these places. California was another place that became very interested as well. And then, of course, our membership grew so that we got people literally all over the world. And what we have found is that people tend to join when they've hit a brick wall. Not always. We do have people literally coming in off the street and saying, I would like to start doing this. It's my father's or grandfather's 90th birthday next March, and I'd love to be able to do his family tree for him. And I know nothing about it. Where do I begin? So we do have members who are complete beginners, and then we've got other people who really know everything about everything and soon tell us as well. But they're very useful at helping people, of course, who hit the brick wall.
Yeah, and that's a great thing about Family History Society. You can share that knowledge with other members and help each other out. So, I mean, it's an interesting as well, your society, because Glasgow is such a melting pot. I don't have any ancestors that went back generations in Glasgow, but I do have ancestors who spent some time in Glasgow. So probably quite a lot of people will be in that situation with, if they've got Scottish ancestors, somebody has probably passed through Glasgow.
Many people who have so-called Glasgow ancestry. In fact, it doesn't go back very far. It's not long ancestry. I'm a typical adopted Glaswegian, if you like. I came here to work. I brought up in Edinburgh, went to Edinburgh University and came to Glasgow to work in the 60s. And I've now lived in Glasgow longer than I've lived anywhere else. And it was only when I started digging around that I found out that I did have Glasgow roots, and that, for example, My grandmother was born in Glasgow. She was, in fact, and her brothers and sisters were orphaned, and they ended up in quarriers' homes. But she never spoke of it, and she never talked about her Glasgow roots, never spoke about her mother, never spoke about her father, because they'd had quite a hard life. So I'm a typical sort of Glaswegian who's discovered I'm a Glaswegian, but very often many of our members join because they think they have Glasgow roots because grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents left from Greenock, left from Port Glasgow, sailed from the Broomielaw, and they think, oh, well, they must be Glaswegians. But often this was just a stepping stone, as you know yourself. People came because Glasgow was such a huge port, and particularly Port Glasgow and Greenock. A lot of people sailed in and out of the city, but when push came to shove, they were actually going to Canada or going to Aberdeen or going to Dundee. Particularly the Irish, of course. The Irish landed in great numbers in Glasgow and then tended to move out into Lanarkshire, Ayrshire, Dundee, and further afield.
Yeah, the wonderful thing is that even if people weren't in Glasgow for very long, they may appear in the records that are in Glasgow. Irene O'Brien joined us a few months ago to tell us about the poor law records that they have, the applications. So these are the sorts of records that people can find. And I know that your society has done a lot as well to help index, and some of those, some records are on the website as well that you can search. So I could just share the website just now.
Interestingly enough, fairly early on, when I came to Glasgow, I was working for Scottish television, and the political editor there was a Glasgow born and bred guy. And he said, you know, there's down in the basement at the city chambers, there's all these old books. You're interested in sort of history and genealogy things. And he says it's full of records of ordinary people. And this must have been literally about 1970. And we got permission to go down and literally into the basement of the city chambers and George Square. And there was water running down the walls. There was these sort of rat traps, you know, the baited rat traps that you often see in old buildings. And these books were lying higgledy-piggledy everywhere. 5,000 Victorian volumes. And although at that time I had just started researching my family tree, I said this was Jimmy Gordon was his name. He later became Lord Gordon of Strathblane. And he was very much a down-to-earth person. He was born in a tenement in Maryhill. And I said, this is genealogical gold. And at the time, it could so easily have been thrown away. The sort of janitor, when we turned up to get the key to go into the basement, sort of said, oh my God, you better change your clothes, hey, and look at you. And I was wearing, you know, old jeans and old jumpers. I said, no, it's okay. He says, listen, I'll give you an overall. You've no idea what it's like doing there. And it was. And so much of this could have been thrown away. And you know this, Emma, 5,000 volumes were saved. 5,000 volumes, great big books full of these poor law applications dating from about 1845, right up to, of course, the start of the welfare state, 1948, although there is a closure period. So I think at the moment you can see up to about 1925, the applications. And then, because the society started, as I say, around about 1977, there was a couple, the Tobins, sadly neither of them with us any longer, who decided they would transcribe these. And when I say transcribe, I'm not talking about talking into a tape recorder with a computer. I'm talking about taking a pencil and a piece of paper and going through and looking at every name and taking a note of every name. And the sort of legacy of that was that we were allowed as a society to keep a copy of that index. We're not allowed to sell it. We can't distribute it. Obviously, our members and anyone who pays a search fee to come into our premises can look at these indexes. And they're an absolute treasure, particularly for people who fell on hard times. Now, the thing is, there are lots of records for people that owned land, even if it was a small business or a small office or a small firm. There are records for people who owned land or who had titles or who were heritors, those and such as those in the communities. Often very little record before about 1841 of the poorest of the poor. And this is why the poor law applications and the books that have survived are such a treasure. And if I can just pass on some good news. Now, I don't know how imminent this is, but we recently had a talk, the Society, from Dr. Irene O'Brien, who is the senior archivist in the Glasgow room, in the Glasgow archives. And the plan is to put these indexes online free. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm always a bit skeptical when people say that you get these for free, and you'll get, because with Irish background, I've known that Irish genealogy until relatively recently has been the black hole of investigation and research. So when Irene said to us, now this was only, I think it's probably, in fact, was it in December she gave us this talk? It's certainly within the last 3 months. The plan is that these are imminently going to go online and free. So if that is true, and can I just say to people who haven't got Glasgow ancestry, it's always worth looking in the poor law, because even although it covers mostly Glasgow and to a certain extent Govan, and I think there are some Lanarkshire poor law records, not many, it's mostly Glasgow. But as I say, there are 5,000 books, there are 1 million names. Sometimes your ancestors might have passed through Glasgow or turned up in Glasgow or walked to Glasgow looking for work, couldn't find work, and had to apply for poor relief. So it's always worth looking in there. And even those with Irish genealogy, particularly, I say to them, please look in these poor law records, because they really are stuffed full. I think a third of the applications are from people with some Irish connection. So it's always worth looking and checking. I've found one ancestor, and because they take so much information, but one not direct ancestor, but a guy called Ian Nisbet, because he was part of my extended family, and because they asked him so many questions about, well, couldn't your brother support you? Couldn't your parents support? There is so much information there that although he was not a direct ancestor, it gave me enough to find, so that's why I couldn't find William, because he'd gone to Canada. Now, I can't, and apart from anything else, of course, you see the originals. And, nowadays with so much online, so much digitized, just to handle a book, just to see a signature, just to see a letter from your great-great-grandfather complaining about his drunken wife. I mean, as Irene said, you've got to hope that if your ancestors weren't landowners and weren't, very high in the community, let's hope they were at the bottom of the rung, because you might find them in the poor law record.
It's true, it's both extremes. The people in the middle who just sort of lived a quiet life,
the last thing you want is your ancestors to be respectable elders of the Church of Scotland. That's absolutely no use. You don't want apart from a few mentions in the Kirk Session records, I mean, you'll never find them. But my goodness me.
Criminals are always nice.
Criminals are good too, yes. Well, I always said I did somebody's ancestry for them. This was somebody who was actually, although he was at Edinburgh University with me, he was living in Germany, and he said, I'd love to find out a bit more. And one of the things I found out, sadly, and I thought it said on the census for his great-grandmother that she was Protestant, and then it had been rubbed out. And I thought, that's funny, why is it so obscure? Then I looked down and saw they were all Protestants, but actually, and they'd all been rubbed out, but of course they were all young women who were actually prostitutes. And somebody had obviously said to the enumerator, you can't write that, get that rubbed out. Now, of course, he was thrilled, but that's because it was his great-great-grandmother. Now, if it had been his mother, would he have been quite so thrilled?
Yeah.
I'm not so sure.
I think this is true, isn't it? You even in the prison register, sometimes they put it, and we were working with some volunteers recently, and we're pretty sure there's an abbreviation which means prostitute. We're going to need to compare all the entries to make sure they are all young women, because it wasn't entirely clear. But often it wasn't stated like that. You have to join the dots together a little bit.
Yes, I mean, although the poor law inspectors, and of course, until First World War, they were all men, and many of them elders of the Church of Scotland, of course. So they were pretty judgmental. You know, if you came in, or if they went to your house and there was the least smell of alcohol or drink, you were condemned as, you know, this drunken family. No, they didn't. They were never drunk, of course. They were never censored by the Kirk session for antenuptial fornication. And this is the one thing, of course, that the poor law records do give you. They do fill in the colourful side, not always the acceptable side, of course, but the colourful side of people's lives, the hardships that they faced. Why did they move so often? Well, they were often moonlight flitting because they couldn't pay the rent anymore. You know, and that gives you, you know, genealogy shouldn't just be a long list of names. That's dead boring. But as soon as you see a letter from the minister saying, this is a very respectable family, but they've fallen on hard times. The boys have had, you know, a stigma in their eyes, or they've had these terrible diseases, or their heads are full of nits. Well, this puts, you know, colour on the bones of your ancestors, and they come alive. So that's what makes it.
That's what it's all about. I would rather get that than, you know, get back to William the Conqueror or something like that. To me, it is about the people.
Well, you know what intrigues me, Emma? People, particularly if they haven't done any genealogy, but they might be interested, but I just want to know, the first thing they say to you is, how far back have you got?
Yeah.
And you think, well, that's not really the point. I mean, most of us haven't got all that far back, unless, as I say, you're landowners or there are titles involved or things like that. And it's not so much getting far back, because the further back you go, the more meaningless really it becomes. You know, you've got 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16, 32, 64. Suddenly you're the direct descendant of hundreds of people. And, you know, there's no way that you'll be able to find out who they all are. And so when I say to them, well, that's not really the point about how far back. Oh, I thought that was exactly the point. So it's sometimes difficult to explain to people. It's finding the stories. And, you know, why did Granny go to Canada? Why did my Uncle William end up in, well, it wouldn't be Barlinnie, it might have been Edinburgh Jail or something like that. And these are the things that people are very interested in, of course. And also, I often give talks about Billy Connolly's ancestry, because he is a typical Glaswegian. In fact, most of his ancestors arrived in Glasgow within the last 150 years. He's got Highland Island ancestry from his mother, who was a MacLean, and they were Gaelic-speaking Presbyterians from Mull. The Connollys, of course, came from Ireland, but he also has Cornish ancestry. I mean, real Cornish ancestry, English. You know, well, I think even Billy Connolly was slightly shocked that he's partly English. One of his ancestors was a customs officer, born and brought up in Cornwall. But of course, you were never stationed where you were born and brought up, because you might be in cahoots with some of the smugglers, especially if they were paying you off or they were your brother-in-law. So it was Charles Mills was his great-great-great-grandfather, born in Cornwall, but he ended up in Galway, married an Irish woman. And that's how he has got English ancestry. So he's a typical Glaswegian. I've got English, Scots, Ireland, and Ireland ancestry. And that's what most Glaswegians are.
We'll have a look then at the website. So you've got quite a lot. I was noticing the other day, I was having a little rummage, and there's quite a lot actually available. The marriage index looks quite intriguing. That caught my eye.
Yes. A lot of the information that started that off certainly came from members when they joined. They were asked, would they like to submit details of their family tree? And some of the members, the volunteers, then used that to create this marriage index, which is very useful, especially with, well, when you see names like Robert Scott and Mary Miller, it's like everything else. You'd be surprised how many Robert Scotts there are. So if you are looking for somebody, and Mary Miller, again, a sort of common name, it just gives you a little bit more information about where they might have come from. And also you might be able to get in touch with the member who submitted it so that you can perhaps share some of the information.
And you've got some other data sets that are also available online. Some of these, again, talking about our everyday ancestors. We've got Glasgow chimney sweeps there, and other records. These are very useful. I like this. This is the Glasgow Herald Births, 1854.
That's right. Well, as you know, anything before 1855 is useful. I mean, all right, the 1841 census we've got, but there's limited information on the 1841 census, as most people will know. So anything that predates 1855 is always useful. The other thing is, funny enough, I was just looking at these porters and hawkers licenses. It's you won't believe it, but you still have to have a hawker's license today. I don't know if it's still called hawker's license, but I think it's called street trader's license. So this goes on. I don't think we're transcribing any of the current records, but it just shows you that ordinary people can appear in the records.
And then you have these, this is what we're talking about, getting a wee bit more information. You've got somebody's height. So it's only a small detail, but I quite like that thing of how tall were they when you're imagining them in your mind.
Even things like addresses. Well, addresses in small towns tend not to change very much. But unfortunately, addresses in a big city like Glasgow often change a lot, and whole areas have been swept away. So I've seen addresses like back row half, and you think surely there was nothing called back row half. But then if you go to some of the transcriptions of, for example, the 1841 census, where we've got lists of streets and street names, and sometimes not so much street names, but say something like the Girls' Asylum or Homeless Man's Hostel or something like that, you can pinpoint on an old map where these were. And that sometimes can be very interesting because, of course, streets that have been swept away and redeveloped rather, the problem is you go to look for them and they're not there anymore, and there's modern flats or modern buildings put up. But if you look at the original maps, you can see, oh, well, that's why he was living in Sparks Row, because he was a pottery man and there was a pottery works just 2 streets away. Most people walked to work until the trams came in. Most people had to walk to work, walk to the shipyards. So they tried to live as close as they could, of course, to their work, so that they weren't spending yet another hour at the end of the day walking home. So it's very interesting. Even just something simple like an actual street with a street number is very useful to pinpointing an area, giving you a view of the area, seeing what a busy area it was.
Yeah, some very useful resources there. The other thing that you have as well, which is very good, are all the journals. So again, I think I was having a look, and I'm right in saying that you can go and you can search for a keyword as well to search those journal articles. So if you're looking into the history of something, you could easily try to find out if somebody already written an article about that.
Yes, I mean, I do say to people, there's nothing more annoying than spending a lot of time and effort building up your family tree from scratch, and then finding that your second cousin, once removed in Perth in Western Australia, has been doing it for 30 years and could have saved you a fortune or saved you a lot of time if you'd only found out about her. Or found out that she was researching this. So we always say to people, particularly look on Ancestry, look on some of the other sites, look on Facebook. Is there somebody researching that tree? Because then you can share a lot of information. Yeah. We've had once, on one occasion, one of our visitors and one of our members from Canada was sitting next to somebody, and she chanced to look over and say to the woman, "Oh, you're doing the MacDougals. Oh, I've got MacDougals. Oh, have you? What are your MacDougals?" Oh, so blow me, they were distantly related. Now, this woman had only ever been once to our premises in Partick from Vancouver, I think it was. What are the chances of that those two people would be sitting next to each other on the same day, researching basically the same extended family? So it's the website we find is really the way forward. Very sadly, about 18 months ago, we lost our webmaster. He was just a young man, Alistair Smith, died very suddenly and very unexpectedly. And it really forced us to say, well, to realize how much work he'd done on the website, but how much it needed revitalizing and more user-friendly. Not that Alistair hadn't made it user-friendly, but he did it as a part-time favor to us. Now we've got a webmaster who really, I know the poor Jean McKenzie spends a lot of time upgrading the website, making it user-friendly, making sure that people, can use it, can find it, and also listening to people who say, well, I looked for the Maryhill Burying Ground Index and I couldn't find it. You said it was on your website. Can you tell me where it is again, please? It's the usual thing. And of course, most of our members, like everything else, hate change. We all hate change. But I must say the website has been a real, really fabulous. And we've noticed a lot more people are using it and going on it and finding out things that they possibly couldn't have found out before.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is if somebody's researching from a distance and they're able to make a connection with somebody who is local to Glasgow, they may already have done something in these original records that they've now been able to share. So it's great to have a place to go and make those contacts.
Well, even just knowing where Sight Hill Cemetery is, we often get people, particularly from overseas, and you say to them, so how long are you spending here? Oh, I'm flying back to Vancouver tomorrow. And you say, oh, why are you leaving it till today? Well, I want to go to Sight Hill Cemetery. Can I get there? We once had a woman from Australia, and her ancestors had come from Knapdale in Argyll. And she said to me, I'm going home on Wednesday. I can't go down to Knapdale. And I said, well, what are you doing tomorrow? Well, I was going to go to the Mitchell Library and just have a dig around. I said, listen. And she was in her 70s. I said, you might never go to Knapdale again. I am going to find out how you can get to Knapdale. And I phoned up the local post office. And by complete chance, the postman there, of course, said, oh, the bus comes in at whatever it is, 10:30 in the morning. I also run a taxi service. I could pick her up. My wife is interested in genealogy. She'll know all the crofts that she could take her to. And this woman had a fabulous day in Knapdale. It was a very long day because she'd take the bus to Knapdale. She did get a bus home. She came back the following year with all her children and grandchildren to go to Knapdale. So it just shows you,
Oh, that's great. That's absolutely brilliant. This is why making a connection with the local Family History Society is such an important thing to do, because you're able to help people out, and that is great, that personal help. So you've also got, I know you've got a large extensive shop there, where there's a lot of things, so people can have a little rummage around and see if there's anything that they need, and something that would help them. This is the sort of thing, a guide to Glasgow addresses, which can be very, very helpful.
Well, as Glasgow grew, of course, from a small borough to a larger borough and took in Govan and Maryhill, it meant there were too many church streets and main streets and station roads. And so a lot of street names did change. And that guide to Glasgow addresses, part 1 or 2, they are very popular, because people, there are different ways as well of finding out where was that street, but it can be very perplexing if time is short. But if there's a book that you can look at and say, so that's where that street was, right, and it's now called something else.
Yeah, it's going to save
or disappeared, of course. Very often they disappear.
Yeah. Well, it's an amazing, wonderful resource. You're obviously very enthusiastic. I know a lot of the volunteers at Family History Societies, they're always very enthusiastic to help people. I know your premises at the moment are obviously closed due to COVID. But as a normal, what sort of services are offered by the Society, especially maybe for people who are not local to Glasgow?
Well, we do get people writing in all the time to the newsletter, a sort of, can you help, or can anyone give any suggestions? And that's very useful. But the magazine only goes out 3 times a year. So by the time you've written in to me, the editor, and I print it, then somebody sees it. Perhaps, 6 months has gone past. Meanwhile, you're champing at the bit to try and find out, why can't I find my great, 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 great grandfather in the Gallagher, or something like that. So we did have a very good team of researchers, but it's like everything else. They get older, they move away, they've got other responsibilities. But we have just had a new volunteer who will do research for people. And of course, as you know, we do have a fantastic resource for Scotland's people, which you can access all over the world, but that can be very expensive if you've got a very common name. So if people write to us, members, of course, if members write to us and write to the research team, they can spend some time when the record offices are open. Unfortunately, they're all closed at the moment, but when the record offices are open, they can go in, and for that £15 or £17 a day, they can look for your particular John McDougall or James Mackenzie, a common name. If you're sitting in Ulaanbaatar, you're not going to find that person on Scotland's People without a certain amount of luck.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. That was a real insight. It's really good of you to join us, and so hopefully if anybody's got any ancestors, which I think most people will do, from the Glasgow area, make sure to join up to the Family History Society and take use of all that wonderful.
Yes, or certainly look at our website. Even just looking at the website, you'll see if it's for you or not for you. I do say to people who come in off the street or meet us at family history fairs, look, there's no point in joining if you've done most of the work anyway, and you're just looking to try and get through a brick wall. It may be that we can't get through that brick wall for you. But look at the website, see if it interests you, see if you think, oh, that would be. Of course, it's the usual thing. I don't know if you're like me, Emma. You go into these websites, particularly the virtual Mitchell with all the photographs, and you suddenly find 2 hours have gone past, and your children are shouting, would you leave your ancestors alone? Your descendants are starving for their tea. And then you've got to say, oh, gosh, 2 hours. How does that go past?
I know, this is what happens. This is exactly what happens. But I think at the moment it's just a great diversion because we can all do it safely from our own homes, and it's interesting and fascinating. And at the moment, it's definitely the perfect thing to do. So, yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Not at all. Thanks. All the best with the conference.
Thank you.